Is an f4 lens like the Tamron 17-50 good enough in low light? Today we're going to find out how good this lens can perform in low light capabilities when it comes down to shooting in limited light or with just artificial light kind of style of footage and photos with the Sony A7 IV and the ZV-E1 for the simple purposes because they have different native ISOs when it comes down to low light capabilities. The Sony A7 IV comes at 3200 when it comes down to the dual native ISO, and the ZV-E1 is like my Sony A7S III, has a 12,800 ISO when it comes down to the low light capability when shooting an S-Log3. One of the main reasons why I wanted to do this test was mainly because most people get off-put when it comes down to an f4 aperture lens. Sometimes it's because they think that you won't get the nice bokeh and kind of separation of the background. Sometimes it's because of the amount of light you need to have to be able to take the right photos and videos when it comes down to using this type of lens. For me personally, I wanted to go ahead and test it out firstly into the tennis courts, where we're going to use the available lights that the tennis courts have with the LED lights from above, just to showcase a little bit of footage and photos that we're able to take out there to see how well it could perform with both cameras. Using the Sony A7 IV was something that was going to be a little bit more challenging because the dual native ISO of this camera starts with 800 and then 3200. So you're already kind of limited depending how much light you want to let in, as well to not damage the image so it doesn't become too grainy. Luckily enough, the Sony A7 IV, using it at the 3200 ISO, was perfectly fine to use within the court to just be able to take some footage whenever it came down to shooting at 4K 24 frames per second. I wanted to go ahead and just try to see how well it would perform, how much would it be allowing of light, if I can do a lot of good, dynamic range with the footage at low light capabilities, because with S-Log3, it's one of the reasons why I like to do it, so I can make sure I capture enough, information in camera to get as much of a better picture out there. Personally, I think it worked out just fine. It works pretty great when it comes down to that type of footage because we're doing the 4K 24 frames per second, which you only have to go at a shutter of 1/50th to make sure that you have the 180 rule within the camera to shoot the footage. Because with the ZV-E1, one of the good things about it is having the 12,800 ISO, but with using this lens setup, you do have to use a variable ND filter to kind of bring it back down to make sure that you have the proper exposure, which is what I did when it came down to using this camera. It allows me to make sure that I have a little bit more wiggle room when it comes down to using, the f4 of the aperture with the lens. So it makes it nicer to be able to have that peace of mind when using a camera like the ZV-E1, or if I was using my Sony A7S III, because of the 12,800 ISO. This allows me to just make sure that I have enough, room for control, if anything, if the lighting isn't the best because of that, dual native ISO at 12,800, versus my A7 IV, I kind of have to hope for the best with the f4 aperture of the lens because I only have so much wiggle room with the 3200 base ISO to make sure that my image is as clean as possible. Can you crank it up more? I'm sure you can. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me personally, I try to keep it as close to the dual native ISO to make sure and I can ensure that I have the nicest image as possible when shooting, all this footage that I want to shoot. Now, another thing I wanted to test out was seeing how well it could do for, doing a little bit slower footage when it came down to each camera perspectively. So we're going to be doing a little bit of slow motion. First up is with a Sony A7 IV doing 60 frames per second, seeing how it'll look. I know already I'm going to be having to go to the 3200 ISO to get that, right exposure relatively good enough. So we're just going to test it out this way with the A7 IV. Then we'll use it with the ZV-E1 because it'd be like my A7S III to try to do with a 12,800 ISO with 120 frames per second to showcase that as well. And now another thing that I wanted to test out is the photography side of the Sony A7 IV with this lens. So the main focus is going to be trying to do a little bit of the freezing framing with this, just to see how well with the f4 it'll look and how well it'll work, because I'm gonna have to crank up the ISO with it. but we'll see how well it works out, because with technology nowadays, even having higher ISO, I don't think it's that big of a deal. The difference will be kind of like the shallow depth of field and the bokeh that you would want to have. So that's what we're going to be testing out in this part of the video when we use the 17-50 and using it at relatively low light, because eventually we'll have more low light capabilities sections that we'll have to test out after this section. For me personally, f4 is not really a horrible thing when it comes down to photography side, since you're shooting raw images. Now most cameras have a really good ISO kind of capabilities of style that you can also bring it down in post for, kind of cleaning up the image if you want to do some denoise or anything that you can do within Lightroom or whatever method you want to use. For me personally, I'm not scared to have a little bit of grain in my photos. So actually, I really never kind of use the denoiser. I'm just kind of go with, if it looks right and it feels right, I'm just going to keep it that way. I'm just going to keep the moment of how it was. And I think it captured it perfectly with this lens. Shooting 17mm all the way to the 50 range, you get the nice wide, but also more telephoto kind of feel of photos with a nice bokeh separation that I think it just works out just nicely, even at f4. Would it be nicer to have an f2.8? Yes, of course, because then you can have a more freezing motion and not have to crank up your ISO for the most part of the photos, which is perfectly fine, but it is all, dealer's choice when it comes down to that. For me personally, I think you can capture really great still images with an f4 lens, so I wouldn't kind of, shy away from going with an f4 lens if your budget allows it better, because you can take some great photos regardless with it, and you'll make sure that you still have some nice compression if you're going to more like the 50 range with an f4 with this lens. So going forward, I wanted to go and test out more limited low light, for the low light capabilities with this lens with both cameras. I wanted to go and hit up our little town that we have, this called Market Street, that we're able to use the immediate lights around us just to kind of capture the footage that we could with both cameras to see how well they would perform in low light. Especially in this scenario is very interesting with the low light because it's very limited of what we have, because we have to use a little bit more of the stores, maybe sometimes a little bit of the movie theater in the background, and there was like a Christmas tree nearby. So we just kind of had to place ourselves correctly to be able to, get as much of the image nicely within the, the model and everything, so that the light would hit correctly, so you would have fairly enough exposure, done right. Off the bat, this ZV-E1 is just way better, and it will be better because of the 12,800 ISO, that it gives you more wiggle room to be able to get footage when it comes down to taking those, limited capabilities of low light, because you're shooting those videos and you can have the 12,800 ISO. For me, with this 17-50 f4, it's perfectly fine with a camera like the ZV-E1 or my A7S III. And even with that limited light, I think it looked very nice. I was able to just use the 12,800 ISO to capture some nice footage with the limited light that we had available. And honestly, it just paired up nicely, that I think you can get by with having a camera like this, because you'll be able to make sure that you have everything covered with the proper exposure. Because moving on with the Sony A7 IV, like I said, with a 3200 ISO, it's fine, but it does start getting, pushing the limits, because I started using it first with the S-Log 3, because I usually like to do that so I can have the most dynamic range and the color grading and everything in post. But I started noticing that it wasn't enough in this limited lighting conditions. I then went ahead and tested out with the S-Cinetone mode only, so that I didn't have to do as much color grading, and I think it would have better retention for the low light capabilities. And to me, I think it worked a lot better. I started just going ahead and doing more of the S-Cinetone, following my wife around just to see how it would look with the limited lights, and it pushed it a little bit better, because I feel like for me, even if you push the S-Cinetone to 6400 or even sometimes 12,800 ISO within the Sony A7 IV, I think you're perfectly fine for what it can do, and it works out nicely. Sometimes you can get lucky and use more, neon light sections like how we did in this one section, that you're able to get more of like the lighting into her so that you have a nicer just image and you're not having to crank up your ISO. But even if you have to, you're still fine, since you don't have to do, double exposure up in a sense like how you would with S-Log3 footage, where you kind of have to have more lighting in to make sure you retain as much information as possible. So for me personally, using the S-Cinetone mode for video with the 17-50 for f4 with low light capabilities with the A7 IV makes just much more sense than using the S-Log3. So if you have a good method to using your low light capabilities when it comes down to your camera, and you know how to set it up that could make better sense for you, don't shy away from an f4 lens, because for the price point of $699, I think you're getting a really great bang for your buck with this lens at 17 to the 50 range to cover all your bases. Personally, I use my Tamron 20-40 a lot more because of the 2.8 aperture that it has. So if you're really wanting to, they're kind of like pretty much, I think, similar price anyway. So you just kind of have to see if you want to have a little bit more wide and a little bit more, kind of like telephoto range of the lens, or if you're fine with a 20-40. So now ultimately, what did this test conclude for me? Well, if you have a camera like the ZV-E1 and you're able to have that 12,800 ISO, I think having an f4 lens is not going to be the end of the world for you. You'll still have that nice bokeh, you still have that nice compression when you go more into the 50mm range, but you'll also be able to have some nice low light capabilities if you want to do slow motion, or if you want to do 24 frames per second, because of the 12,800 ISO that allows more light into the sensor, even if you're shooting with the f4 that this lens provides. Because now if I was having to only have my Sony A7 IV, I would be a little bit more hesitant to go with this lens, just because the lower light capabilities of the A7 IV are good, but they're not nearly as good as the niche, ZV-E1 and the A7S III when it comes down to video. For photography, I think you're perfectly fine. I think this lens is more than enough and capable for low light capabilities, especially like I said, you can do so much more with the denoiser if you need to really remove some stuff in post or anything like that. And most of these cameras shooting that higher ISO range, I think you'll be more than perfectly fine. And you can do so much with the raw images that honestly an f4, I'm not scared of it when it comes down for photo. For video, maybe not so much, inclined to do that. So hopefully that kind of clears up a little bit of the ideas that you might want to, consider when kind of going with this lens or not, depending on the camera that you shoot with. So now I'm curious to know, what do you think about the Tamron 17-50 f4 lens for low light capabilities? Is it something that you think would be worth it, or are you wanting to maybe sacrifice a little bit of the focal range to go with a 28-75 f2.8, or the Tamron 20-40, or the 17-28, since those shoot at, f2.8, or even if you wanted to get a little bit more expensive in the range, going with the 35-150 because it has that f2 to 2.8. For the price point, I think obviously more staying closer to it, the 28-75 might be a better range for most people if you're wanting to have a decent enough wide but more the telephoto range. But the sweet spot to me, I think, would be the 20-40 because it's an f2.8 and it's basically similar price to the 17-50 f4. If you're wanting to be more of a type of vlogger with having some good lens for b-roll and photos, then this is going to be a great lens for you, because you're able to have that nice wideness when you're trying to vlog, as well as getting some nice up closer with a 35 and 50 range to be able to do some nice b-roll and also some photos, because the f4 I think is perfectly fine for that. Now it just depends if you want to do it in low light, if it would be the right choice for you, but that ultimately is always up to you to see if it checks your list, to make sure that it's the right lens for you to have. But with all that said and done, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe to this video with a friend. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.